This is the third video in the series for this particular lesson, and we're looking at the model view controller architecture or design pattern. And this is the video where we're going to talk about the product manager, which is one of two parts of this application, the first being the product catalog. And as you remember, the product catalog was what the end user sees. The product manager is what the employees see, and they use it to add products and categories into the database. So the way this was structured, if you remember, was the home page right here brought up a menu that showed either choice, and then because both of these sub-applications access the same tables, there was one model that was built to handle both. So the model contains these three files. We talked about those. And the part of the view that's common to everything was placed up here. So there are view files in these folders, these two folders. As a matter of fact, if you look in these folders, index is the controller. These are both views. And then for product manager, same thing. Index is the controller, and here are your views. You could say that this is a controller, although there's no, I guess I would rather call that a view because it doesn't access the model and all there is user interface in it. So if you say that, then we'll say that the home page and its associated style sheet are both views. Obviously the model folder has the model stuff in it. The view folder has some view files, but these are included at the top and bottom of all the other views, which are located in these two folders. And again, the product catalog has a controller and two views. Manager has a controller and two views. So what I did was I loaded these three files into my text editor, and index being the controller, we'll start with that. And what I did this time was I added some comments to the controller page. I didn't do this for the other one, the product catalog, but I did it for this one just so that you had an example that illustrated what this was doing. And it turns out that the product, or the controller for the product catalog, is a lot simpler and does pretty much the same stuff this does. So I just put the comments in this file and not in the other one. So what I'll do is I'll attach the whole site to a zip file and put that into Blackboard. But this particular controller file has the comments in it. So what we've got here, first off, the controller needs to talk to or access the model. And so the first thing that we do here is we bring in all of the files that make up the model. And those are basically, the first one connects to the database, and then the second two are filled with functions that you can call from the controller. And as I said in the last videos, it's very important that the view files never talk to the model, because you want to keep things separated in a certain way. That is mandated by the design pattern, and that provides you the flexibility of swapping out different views for a specific controller model pair. You can't really separate the controller from the model, but you can separate the model from the view by swapping out different views. So here we bring in our model, and then what we do is we start by taking a look at the action attribute to see if it exists, and it's either going to be posted through a form or it's going to be passed in on the URL through a get. Either way, if it exists, we're going to check it and validate it. And if it's not valid, we're going to set it to list products. If we find it, we'll read it in. And that's what happens here. So if we find it in the post, we read it in. If we don't find it in the post, we look for it in the get. If we find it, we bring it in. If we can't find it in the post, and we can't find it in the get, then we just assume that the user is in here to just to view a list of the products, which is the default action. for the page. And certainly when they come in off the main menu to this page fresh, that's exactly what they want. It's just to start with a list of the products. So that makes sense. So then what we do is we get into a series of if-else statements that take a look at that action attribute, which describes why we're here. And if action is equal to list products, it proceeds to do that. Notice the controller is preparing ultimately to display the view. And it does that by including the view, and it's the last thing the controller does. So the controller prepares it basically gets everything that the view needs from the model, and that's what's happening in through here. These are all calls to the model. It's getting information, and the information is being stored in these variables on the left. Once it has everything that the view needs, it hands control back to the view, and that's happening here. So the controller's purpose is to access the model, get what the view needs from the model, and then call the view, and the view will access those variables that the controller prepared. And that happens in every case. Notice in the next case, if you want to delete a product, again, you're getting the information you need to proceed, and then you're calling the model to do the work. And then in this case, you're just simply passing control back to the view that you came from, which will show the same thing you had before, but there'll be one less product in it because you just deleted one. If you're here to add a product, calls the model to get the category list, which the view needs, and this is the call to the view right here. And then if you're here to add a product, again, the data is obtained and checked. If it's not right, it brings up an error view. Otherwise, it brings up a view that refreshes the page and shows one more product. And of course, before the controller calls the view, it makes a call to the model to do the work. So in every one of these cases, going back to the top here, in every one of these cases, you end up with a view. In this case, you could have two pathways, an error pathway or a valid pathway to a view. In this particular case here, there's your view. And in this last case, again, you have two paths. You can either bring up an error view or back to the default view. So they all work that way. So then it's just a matter of looking at the details. So like for instance, in the case of list products here, in order to list the products, you need to know what the category is, because they only want to see the products of that particular category type. The assumption is if you're going to list products, that the category ID is going to be passed in through the get, which means it'll be put up on the URL, which potentially means that the data will not be valid because the user may mess around with the URL address, or they may get here in some invalid way. In either case, if the category ID is missing or it's invalid, it will default to 1. Many times this will happen where the category ID will be missing, because in that event it's intentional, because that means you want to see all of the that you want to see the first category instead of a specific one that the user had chosen. So once you have your category ID, either by default selection or by intent, you then invoke the model call to get the category name, which the view needs. You get a list of categories, which the view needs. That gets displayed on the left side of the page in that list. And then you get the products by category. So you only get the products that pertain to the category the user wants to see. That comes into this array, and then control gets passed to the view. Now the product list view, I'll just jump right into that. he begins by including the header piece of the view. And of course, the view has HTML in it. Notice that the model doesn't have any HTML, which it shouldn't. We looked at that in the first video. But the controller doesn't have any HTML in it either. If I look at this controller code, there's no HTML in here at all. And that's the way it should be. The only HTML rendered should be in the view pages. So with that said, let me go back to product list. They want to see a list of products. So we get into our HTML, we show a header. In our aside block, which is on the left side, we show our categories. And we have this categories plural was passed in from the controller. So we iterate through it, putting up a hyperlink for each category, which the style sheet renders into a menu. And each menu item is a hyperlink referencing the same page, i.e. index.php, which basically means when you click a category, you're going to reload the controller page, but there'll be a category ID present and set. There's no action attribute, so the controller will assume it's a list products. If it's null, it assumes list products. But there will be a category ID, so they're going to see a specific category. This is common to all of the views, this sidebar piece. You could conceivably put this in its own separate file and include it, which is typically a good idea if you find yourself duplicating code in all of your views. It's good to do what we did with the header and the footer. You can do that with anything. So we could take this whole block and put that into a file and include that here. But if there are any differences inside of it, then it may not be such a good idea. The bulk of the page is in this section here. And in the section, we display a table. Here's our legend at the top. And then for each product in products, this again was populated by the controller, which used the model to do so. The view echoes each product and displays its code, name, and price in a table in columns. And then your last column has a form in it. And the form's action is set to a dot, which basically means reload the same page. Earlier you saw, where did we see that before? Oh, maybe you didn't see that before. Okay, never mind. So we have the dot, method is equal to post, and then all of this stuff here is going to get posted. Notice these are all hidden fields, so that's because they need to be packaged up in the form, and the only way you can do that is through input controls, which are normally visible. So they made a hidden type to send information from a form to another destination, and it's a way of passing data without making it visible. So you're basically setting an action, a product ID, and a category ID, echoing those IDs with PHP from the product array for every product that you have. So again, one of these gets built for every product, one row per product. This column has a form in it where all the data is placed in, but it's hidden. The only thing that's visible is a delete button. So for every row, you'll see a delete button on the right. When that's clicked, it reloads the page, and it shows, it presents all this data via post. The controller then handles that. And we'll talk about delete product here shortly. Well, this loops through, and then at the end, the table wraps up. You have a closing paragraph where you can add a product. This brings up the controller and sets action equal to show add form. And then we have our footer. And that's our view. So we looked here and we saw the capability of deleting a product and the ability to add a product with show add form to add a product, and then delete product to delete a product. Now, if I go back to my controller, we just went through this first one, the list products scenario. Our view had given our end user the ability to delete a product, which will pass that action attribute into the controller and run this code. It also gave us a show add form. It did not give us an add product. We'll talk about where that came from in a minute. But let's go back up to the case where they wanted to delete a product and they hit that delete button. If that occurs, the code is going to come down to this else block. It's going to look for a product ID, which is the ID of the product to delete, and then we're going to get a category, which is the category of the product being deleted. Now the reason that's sent in is that after you delete the product from the category, the page will reload itself and only the products in that category will appear. So what happens is the user picks a category, they see a list of products, they delete a product, and then it still keeps them in the same category, but it just will have one less product in it. What you don't want to do is for the user is have them pick a category, choose a product, delete it, and then when the page refreshes, have it default back to the first category. You want it to stay where they were so that that state is persisted across the submission of the data through a form. So if they decide to delete a product, you gather the IDs. If they're invalid, you populate an error string and include an error view, terminating the controller's role. Otherwise, if everything looks good, you invoke a method call to the model to delete the product, passing the ID to it, and then you bring up your view, which is essentially refreshing the same controller page and passing in a category ID to display only the products of that category. So that's the delete product piece. The other piece we looked at in our product list was the ability, after you see all your products, to click a hyperlink to add a product, which sets action to show add form and it refreshes the page. That brings up our controller and sends us here. When we want to add a form, we need to populate that sidebar with categories. So we get the categories from the model, set the array variable, and then we just include product underscore add, which is another view. That's this view. This guy, his purpose is to create a bunch of text boxes so the user can enter the stuff they need to add a product. So we create a form. It posts back to index.php. Its method is post. Its ID is add product form. And inside of it we have a hidden field with an action set to add product. What that means is if a person wants to add a product, they click the add product hyperlink, which reloads the controller with an action set to show add form. The controller comes up, goes down to show add form, and that brings up product add. Product add comes up, presents a form filled with controls where the user fills everything in. When they click the add product button, it submits the form, takes it back to the controller, and it sets action to add product. Controller comes back, you come down to add product, you pull everything in from the form where they typed everything in, so you get the ID of the category, the product code, product name, product price. If all of that stuff is valid, you add the product via a call to the model. And then you refresh the controller page showing the category for which you added the product to. If something goes wrong and it's invalid, you create an error and you include the error view. So, back in product add. So you've got this form, right? And on the form, you have your action value hidden input control, so you know what's going on when you go back to the controller, what you have to do there. Then you have a label, you have your list of categories being put into a select control. So the user has to pick the category into which to add the product. when they do that, the category ID will equal a certain value. They're going to do the same thing for the code of the product, the name of the product, and the price, and of course your submit button here. You give them the ability to view a product list on this page. And here's the thing. If they're in the middle of adding a product, they have to hit the submit button, which is called add product, on the page that they see. They have to click that button to add the product. If they type a bunch of stuff in and they hit view product list, it's going to abandon what they were doing for adding and refresh the page, and it'll go and basically blow away what they were trying to do. We don't warn them in this case. We could, but it would involve a lot more work. So instead, we just ignore that and say, well, if they don't click add product, it's their problem. It's what they're supposed to do. With some training, they'll learn that technique pretty quickly. But the bottom line is they're going to pick a category, type the rest of the stuff in, they're going to click add product, they're going to then get reposted back to the controller, and the action attribute was set to add product. It's going to take them to this piece. They're going to add in the product, and then they're going to refresh the controller page showing the category that the user had selected for that new product that they just added. So all of that fits together nicely and works. Now, one question you might be thinking is, how on earth would I know how to build all this stuff? And all I can really tell you is that you learn by looking at what other people do. I mean, unless you're really super, super smart and you can just invent this stuff on your own, which I'm not, okay? So I learned by looking at lots and lots of examples. I'll take something like this and I'll use it and I'll change it. If I understand what it does, I can make changes to it. And as long as I don't get too carried away, I can keep, things under control and what's happening. But you need to understand this thing inside and out in order to do that. And so that's what you do. You look at examples of other people's stuff. And, if it's something that no one's ever done before, then that's a little more difficult. But generally, that's not typically the case. This stuff that we're doing has been done before. It's just a matter of you're customizing the data that you're working with, the user interface, and the workflow to a certain extent. That said, you may learn an example, and then a week or two or a month or so later, you'll find another example that does the same thing, but it's better than what you did. And that happens, and then you start using the better example. So that's what I would say would be my advice to you, other than the things we've already talked about, where you keep things separate. The model, view, controller all be separate. You can't keep the controller and the model separate. But the model shouldn't know about the controller, and the view shouldn't know about the controller. The view and the model should be completely independent of one another, and of anything else for that matter. But the controller should and must know about the two things to either side. You can think of the model and the view as two pieces of bread in a sandwich. The two pieces of bread don't need to know about each other. The filling in the middle, quote unquote, talks to the bread, and the bread talks to the filling, but the bread never talks to the other piece of bread. You could take a piece of bread and it does what it does. It doesn't need another piece of bread to exist. It's just a piece of bread. But when you make a sandwich out of the thing, the filling is really the core of the program. The controller is driving things. That's why in this application, when you bring it up, quote unquote, when you bring it up, you're bringing up the controller page. And he interacts with the model, and he brings in the appropriate views based on what the controller needs to do. So if you understand that design philosophy and stick to that, then you'll be conforming to the right pattern, and you'll be doing what you're expected to do, implementing an MVC architecture. So with that, I think I'm going to close this third part out. That will complete our series. If you guys have any questions, obviously let me know. But I'm going to wrap this thing up and move on and make the next video for you guys in the coming chapter. So I hope this is helpful. As always, if you have any questions, drop me an email. Otherwise, we will see you in the next video. Take care.